The smell of motor oil and grease always brought me comfort. It was like my dad was still right there beside me, patiently teaching me every little detail about the cars he loved so much. The old garage in the backyard, with its exposed brick walls and big windows that let in the perfect light for working, had become my refuge ever since Richard Wilson, the man everyone in the neighborhood called when they needed their classic European cars fixed, left this world. His tools still hung on the same walls. Every screwdriver, every pair of pliers had a story, a bit of wear that spoke of decades dedicated to restoring cars that others had written off. I inherited not only this two-story house in the historic Parkview neighborhood, but also the talent and passion for that careful work that turns rusted metal into moving masterpieces. That Saturday morning, while I was polishing the freshly painted hood of a 1968 Jaguar E-Type, I realized it had been exactly 1 year since I took over this space. Not as a business, I keep my job as a graphic designer during the week, but as a continuation of a legacy that defines me just as much as my own name. Emily Wilson, 32. Daughter of the best restorer of classic European cars this city ever knew. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this. The first letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, an official envelope with the Parkview Residents Association logo, now under new management. I opened it without much worry, thinking it was just some routine community event announcement. Notice of violation, unauthorized commercial activity in a residential zone. I read it 3 times before I understood. Someone had reported my garage as an illegal business. Attached to the letter was a photo of my garage with the door open, the Jaguar partially visible, and a highlighted copy of the rule that banned commercial activities. I called the association immediately. "It's just a hobby," I explained to the monotone-voiced secretary. "I work on old cars on weekends just like my dad used to. It's not a business." 2 weeks later, another notice arrived. This time it was about the inadequate aesthetic of the property. Apparently, the deep blue paint my dad chose decades ago was no longer in the approved historical color palette of the new committee. The original wooden windows needed to be replaced by specific models. The fence had to be redesigned. The tone of the letters quickly shifted from compliance suggestions to demands with deadlines. Every envelope brought new rules, impossible requirements, and increasing fines, all under the pretext of preserving the historic character of the neighborhood. The first sign that something was really off came when I found muddy footprints along the side of the house, a spot I rarely used. The next day, my security camera at the back was turned off. Checking the previous recordings, I saw a man in a dark coat watching my property, taking notes. The feeling of being watched grew when I started noticing a black car parked regularly on the corner. Always empty, always facing my house. One morning, when I went out to work, I found marks on the lock of the garage door. Someone had tried to force it open overnight. I installed more cameras and motion sensor lights, but even those started showing inexplicable, technical glitches. Then the message arrived. A simple envelope with no return address, containing just a sheet with the words, "Some places aren't for everyone. Maybe it's time to consider an environment more suited to your lifestyle." This was no longer about neighborhood rules. It was deliberate intimidation. The next day, I found motor oil spilled on the sidewalk in front of my house, a clear sign that my passion for cars was the real target. The sound of the alarm woke me at 3:17 in the morning. I rushed down the stairs, but when I got to the garage door, the silence had returned. The door was open, its lock shattered with professional precision. Inside, there were only empty spaces where compressors, welders, grinders, diagnostic tools once stood. Decades of specialized equipment and meticulously organized toolboxes, all gone. The walls, once covered with tools, now only bore the marks of their former hangers. In the center of the concrete floor lay an official envelope. Property confiscated pending further review due to continuous violations. Contact the Residents Association for appeal procedures. But it wasn't the association that did this. No legitimate organization breaks into properties in the dead of night. The external cameras had been disabled again, and the internal ones removed by the intruders. I sat on the cold floor of the empty garage, surrounded only by ghosts of memories. My hands trembled as I held my phone. This was no longer just about defending a property or a hobby. This was about fighting against something far bigger and more dangerous than I had imagined. "Do you still have that collection of your dad's old cameras?" Uncle Michael's voice sounded comforting on the other end of the line. Even at 4 in the morning, he answered on the first ring, as if he had been waiting for my call. "I do." "Why?" "Bring them when you come over. And don't mention this call to anyone." 2 hours later, I parked in front of the modest house on the outskirts of town. Michael Wilson, 58, a former detective with 25 years on the force, greeted me with a strong hug before I even rang the bell. "Show me everything," he said, guiding me to his back office. The walls displayed certificates and photos from his police days, but also detailed maps of the city and recent newspaper clippings. While I recounted the events of the past few months, Michael took notes, occasionally asking precise questions about dates, descriptions, patterns. When I mentioned the Residents Association, he stopped writing and looked me right in the eye. "Emily, this isn't about neighborhood regulations. What you're describing is a classic pattern of organized intimidation." He opened a drawer and pulled out a dossier. In the last 18 months, 3 historic neighborhoods in the region have gone through similar processes. It always starts with a new management, new rules, and ends with original owners selling their properties below market value to mysterious investment companies. "Why are you looking into this?" "Because your dad asked me to." He smiled sadly. "Richard suspected something even before he got sick. He told me to keep an eye on things. I'm sorry it took me so long to connect the dots." Michael spread out a city map on the table. "This isn't ending with the theft of your tools, Emily. In fact, it's just beginning. But now we're 2 in this game. We need to document everything, establish patterns, and identify the real players," Uncle Michael explained, as he arranged surveillance equipment on his table. "Your old cameras will be perfect. They're analog, making them impossible to hack remotely." Over the next 2 weeks, we transformed his house into our command center. The guest room became an investigative mural. Photos, names, dates, and connections linked with colorful lines that grew with each new day. Michael taught me to note every detail, no matter how insignificant. "Let's start by tracking your tools," he suggested. "Specialized restoration equipment isn't easy to sell or hide. It has a very specific market." Using his old contacts, Michael visited garages, junkyards, and pawn shops around town. Meanwhile, I kept an eye on secondhand sale websites and collector groups. The answer came when we stumbled upon a discreet classified ad on an old parts forum offering a complete collection of professional European restoration tools. "No one would offer such a specific set all at once," Michael observed. "It's your equipment, almost certainly." We arranged a meeting, pretending to be interested buyers. The seller suggested an industrial warehouse in the west side of town. Michael parked 2 blocks away and handed me a tiny device. "Transmitter. Keep it in your pocket. If anything goes wrong, say, 'I need to check the technical specs.' That's our signal for me to step in." The warehouse was larger than I had imagined, divided into several sections. A burly man opened the side door and led me to an area sectioned off by makeshift partitions. I immediately recognized my organized tools on display. But what took my breath away was that they occupied only a small part of the space. All around, dozens of other sets of equipment were stacked and tagged with the names of streets and neighborhoods. "Are they all original?" "They look pretty used," I commented casually. "As original as it gets. Straight from the owner's hands," he replied with an unpleasant smile. "We also have old furniture, historic construction materials. Let's just say we're experts in urban recycling." While we were negotiating, I noticed some documents piled up on an improvised table. I discreetly snapped a few photos, architectural plans for luxury condominiums, exactly in the same historic neighborhoods Michael had mentioned. I left without buying anything, promising to come back with the rest of the money. 2 blocks later, I climbed into Michael's car, out of breath. "This is an organized operation," I blurted, showing him the photos. "They're stealing historic construction materials, tools, everything valuable from the houses before the residents are forced out." Michael reviewed the images. "This is just the tip of the iceberg. We need to find out who's behind the whole operation." Our investigation led us into a complex web of shell companies. Using techniques Michael had learned from his police days, we traced property owners, fiscal addresses, and financial connections. Each step revealed another layer of corruption. One night during our research, we found the first concrete link: West Side Development Group, a newly formed company that had bought 4 properties in my neighborhood over the last 6 months, all after disputes with the Residents Association. The company's founder? Jonathan Mercer, the nephew of the new president of our association. "This is how it works," Michael explained. "First, they create impossible problems. Then they show up as saviors offering to buy your problem property for low prices." I decided to infiltrate the next Residents Association meeting. Sitting discreetly at the back of the room, I recorded the entire session where they announced new, special preservation zones. Coincidentally, exactly the same areas as the properties recently purchased and my own house. We need concrete evidence linking the intimidation to the buyers, Michael insisted. The opportunity came when we pinpointed a smaller storage unit used to keep documents for the operation. Using surveillance techniques Michael had taught me, we monitored the location for 3 days, tracking movement patterns and access windows. On a Wednesday night, when the storage was empty, we managed to access the files. What we found exceeded our expectations. Detailed records of each target property, specific tactics of intimidation for each resident, and, most importantly, a complete list of pending acquisitions, with predetermined values well below market prices. We need more, Michael concluded as we digitized documents. This proves an unethical real estate scam, but it doesn't directly tie into the thefts and intimidation. The final piece fell into place when we found an accounting ledger listing payments for persuasion services, with dates that exactly matched the incidents at my house and other targeted properties. An anonymous call came in on a Thursday afternoon. I answered my cell without recognizing the number. "Miss Wilson?" The man's voice sounded nervous. I used to work for the people behind your property. I need to talk to you, in person." I agreed reluctantly, taking every precaution Michael had taught me. The meeting was set at a busy cafe downtown. Michael would be sitting at a nearby table, positioned strategically. The man appeared to be about 45 years old, with graying hair at the temples and deep dark circles under his eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he held his coffee cup. "I'm Daniel. I worked in security for the operation," he began, constantly glancing around. "I wasn't hired for this. It started as surveillance, then escalated to intimidation. And now," he paused, swallowing hard, "I decided to quit when I saw the list." "What list?" I asked, feeling my stomach drop. He slid an envelope across the table. "The list of obstacles. People who resisted too much, who wouldn't give in to normal tactics. People like you." Inside the envelope, a printed sheet showed 10 names with addresses. Mine was third, marked with a red asterisk. "The asterisk means priority," he explained, lowering his voice even more. "I overheard conversations about permanent solutions. I didn't sign up for that. I have a family." My blood went cold. "Are you telling me they're planning to—" "Accidents happen," he interrupted, "especially with stubborn people who live alone in old houses. Short circuits, gas leaks, you know?" I slowly nodded, unable to speak. "This isn't just a real estate scam," he continued. "It's a full-on development project. They want the whole neighborhood. Millions in potential profit. The scheme even has connections in the city hall. The planning department, even—" He hesitated, glancing around nervously. "Some police officers are involved. Why are you telling me this?" "Because you crossed a line," he replied, standing up. "And because you and your uncle, the ex-cop, are getting too close. They know about your investigation." Before he left, he handed over a USB stick. Copies of internal communications, lists of targeted properties, and most importantly, the names. The real ones in charge, not just the pawns. "Be careful who you trust, Miss Wilson. They have eyes everywhere." I met Michael outside the cafe. His face hardened as he saw the envelope's contents. "This has taken things to another level," he said as we drove back. "We can't just go to the local police. We need a broader strategy." That night, we analyzed the files on the USB. The scale of the operation was much larger than we'd imagined. It wasn't just about our neighborhood. It was part of a coordinated plan of forced gentrification in 3 historic districts, with the potential to expand. The final project: a complex of luxury condos, exclusive commercial areas, and a resort, all disguised as historical revitalization. One name kept popping up in all the documents: Victor Harmon, CEO of Harmon Properties, apparently the mastermind behind the entire operation. "I know Harmon," Michael murmured. "We tried investigating him years ago on suspicion of bribing city officials. The case mysteriously disappeared. As we reviewed the files, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street. I immediately turned off the lights. "We're being watched," I whispered. Michael nodded calmly. "I was expecting that. It's time to implement our contingency plan." Within minutes, we copied all the data to separate devices. Michael stored one set in his safe, while I hid another in a secret cavity my dad had built into the frame of the partially restored Jaguar. That night, we took turns sleeping, always on guard. The threat had become tangible, palpable. It was no longer just about protecting a property or a legacy. We were fighting for our lives. When you're outnumbered and outgunned, surprise becomes your best weapon. Michael explained as we mapped out our plan on the kitchen table. They expect us to run or back down. We're going to do exactly the opposite. Our strategy had 3 fronts: documentation, exposure, and direct confrontation. The first phase began with assembling detailed evidence packages, copies of documents, records of intimidation, photos, audio recordings, financial details of the companies involved, and the list with my name marked. We can't just rely on the local authorities, Michael explained. We need to build a broader safety net. We sent physical and digital copies to multiple recipients: the State Attorney General's office, federal agencies, 3 investigative journalists from different outlets, a law professor specializing in real estate fraud, and an NGO fighting predatory gentrification. Each package contained only part of the evidence, but together they formed a complete picture of the operation. Fragmented distribution, Michael said. If they intercept one package, they still don't have the whole puzzle. The second phase was about creating visibility. I started meticulously documenting every code violation, act of intimidation, and damage to my property on an anonymous blog, linking them to the patterns we'd identified in other neighborhoods. Other residents began sharing similar experiences in the comments. And then, Michael used his contacts to organize an unofficial community meeting in a neutral location. Dozens of residents showed up, many sharing their own stories of intimidation. What we're facing isn't just a strict residents association, I explained to the group, showing copies of the documentation. It's an organized attempt to force out original owners so they can flip our neighborhood into a luxury development project. The word spread quickly. Residents began installing cameras, forming community watch groups, and sharing information. The power of the intimidators had been their isolation of victims, but now they were facing a united, vigilant community. They're backing off, Michael observed a week later, showing me surveillance reports. Fewer suspicious cars, fewer incidents. They're rethinking their approach. Then came the news we'd been waiting for. A journalist we had contacted published an in-depth article on the scheme. The piece didn't mention our identities, but it cited insider sources and extensive documentation. The article questioned the links between Harmon Properties, municipal officials, and the recent wave of forced revitalizations in historic neighborhoods. The third phase was the riskiest: confrontation. Using information from the USB, Michael managed to get a personal phone number for Victor Harmon, the man behind the entire operation. "Are you sure about this?" Michael asked, handing me the phone prepped with a recording device. I took a deep breath and checked our carefully planned script one more time. Absolutely. Harmon's secretary tried to screen the call, but I used the name of one of the partner companies mentioned in the documents, ensuring the call was transferred. "This is Harmon." A deep, confident voice answered, the voice of someone used to being in control. "Mr. Harmon, my name is Emily Wilson. I'm the owner of the house at 1428 Maple Street." I paused deliberately. "The house with the red asterisk on your obstacles list." The silence on the other end said it all. "I'm calling to let you know that your operation is compromised," I continued in a measured tone. "Right now, detailed documentation of your activities is being delivered to multiple federal and state agencies, independent media outlets, and oversight organizations." "I don't know what you're talking about," he finally replied, his voice turning cautious. "Making unfounded accusations can have serious legal consequences, Miss Wilson." "The legal consequences are exactly what I'm talking about, Mr. Harmon. Systematic intimidation, real estate fraud, bribery of officials, covert threats against property owners." I methodically listed every documented crime. "And of course, that interesting obstacles list with my name marked for permanent removal. Your associates should be more careful about who they trust." I heard him take a deep breath. His tone shifted to something more conciliatory. "Perhaps we started off on the wrong foot. I'm sure we can reach a mutually beneficial agreement. How about we meet to discuss an adequate compensation for your property? I could offer you significantly above market value." "I'm not interested in negotiating, Mr. Harmon. This call isn't an opening for discussion, it's a warning. Your operation is being exposed as we speak. I suggest you use your remaining time to consult your lawyers instead of trying to bribe more people." "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he hissed, abandoning the cordial facade. "I built this city. I have connections you can't even imagine. Do you think you can threaten me and simply—" "I'm not threatening, I'm informing," I interrupted. "And I already have all the documentation on your connections, including that yacht meeting with 3 city council members last week. Some very interesting images, I might add." There was a stunned silence. "Watch the news tomorrow, Mr. Harmon. Have a nice day." I hung up before he could respond. Michael looked at me in admiration. "Perfect. Now they'll be too busy covering their tracks and protecting themselves to continue chasing us. In the following 48 hours, we watched the operation unravel rapidly. The initial article triggered a series of investigative reports. State authorities announced an investigation into predatory development practices. The district attorney held a press conference on the serious allegations of municipal corruption related to revitalization projects. In our neighborhood, we immediately saw the surveillance disappear. The violation notices stopped. The Residents Association abruptly canceled its next meeting. "They're scrambling to cover their tracks," Michael observed while we watched the news. "When rats realize the ship is sinking, their first instinct is to jump off." Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this. The criminal operation collapsed like a house of cards. The morning after my call to Harmon, a series of search warrants were issued for the offices of Harmon Properties, the Residents Association, and the warehouse where my tools had been stored. Federal agents recovered not only the stolen equipment from dozens of owners, but also detailed financial records linking the scheme to city officials. The local press dubbed the case the biggest fraudulent development scheme in city history. The first arrests came 3 days later. The Residents Association administrator, 2 security agents involved in the intimidation, and a planning department employee were cuffed. Victor Harmon had disappeared, but his name was on a federal arrest warrant. "He probably fled to some country without extradition," Michael commented as we followed the developments. "Men like him always have an escape plan." A week after the initial exposure, I got a call from the police department. They had recovered my tools and equipment during the seizures. When I went to pick them up, the detective in charge looked at me with a mix of admiration and curiosity. "Great work, Miss Wilson," he said as he signed the release forms. "Not many people could take down an operation of this magnitude." "I had good guidance," I replied simply. My dad's tools returned to the garage, each finding its old spot on the walls. Some were damaged, others missing, but the essence of the place, the spirit my dad had built, was finally back. The Residents Association was completely dissolved after an emergency community vote. In its place, we set up a truly representative community council, with transparent rules and a focus on preserving the neighborhood's historic character without oppressing its residents. Gradually, life began to return to normal, but with one fundamental difference. Now we knew our neighbors. The isolation that had allowed the crime to flourish was replaced by a united and vigilant community. We organized events, set up communication groups, and established an informal shared surveillance system. On a sunny Sunday afternoon, 3 months after the final showdown, I heard a knock on the garage door. It was Margaret, a 70-year-old lady who lived 2 houses down the street. We'd never really talked before the crisis. "Hi, Emily. Sorry to interrupt your work," she said, glancing at the Jaguar I was still restoring. "I just found some old tools in the attic. They belonged to my husband Frank. He loved restoring old furniture before he passed away. I thought maybe you could put them to good use." I accepted the little wooden box containing perfectly preserved precision tools. It was more than a gift. It was a symbol of how our community had changed. "Margaret, would you like to learn how to restore that old dresser you mentioned last week? I could teach you a few basic techniques." Her face lit up. "I'd love that. Frank always said I had a steady hand for detailed work." The news about the case continued for months. 2 city councilors resigned amid corruption investigations. The real estate scam was completely dismantled, with assets frozen and contracts canceled. Our neighborhood was officially designated as a protected historic district, ensuring extra safeguards against future predatory schemes. One day, while working on the Jaguar, Uncle Michael showed up with a package wrapped in brown paper. "I thought this belonged to you now," he said, handing over the package. Inside was a worn leather vest I instantly recognized. The work vest my dad used on every restoration project. "Where did you find that?" "During the last seizure. It was among the collectible items they planned to sell separately. I pulled some strings to get it released before the official auctions." I put on the vest, feeling its familiar weight on my shoulders. It still carried the smell of motor oil, and the leather was molded just where my dad used to hunch over the engines. "He'd be proud of you, Emily," Michael said as he watched me work on the Jaguar's carburetor. "Not just for saving the garage, but for saving the whole neighborhood." 6 months after the showdown, I finished restoring the 1968 Jaguar E-Type. Its dark green paint shone under the afternoon sun as I made the final adjustments to the engine. This car had been my dad's last project before he fell ill. Completing it meant more than just restoring a vehicle. The next morning, before sunrise, I turned the key for the first time. The deep, smooth roar was exactly as my dad had described in his notes. like a big cat waking from a long sleep. I drove through the neighborhood as the sun came up, greeting early risers who waved, recognizing the car and its driver. People who had barely noticed me before now called out my name, some even stopping to chat about their own restoration projects, from old furniture to historical neighborhood photos. I briefly parked in front of where the old Residents Association office used to be. A new community center was being built, partially funded by money recovered from the dismantled real estate scam. The project included a small educational workshop where residents could learn basic techniques for restoring and maintaining historic houses. As I watched the construction, I realized that I had restored more than just cars and tools. I had helped restore an entire community. My dad's legacy lived on not only through my hands working on old engines, but through the bonds formed between neighbors who now looked out for each other. I started the Jaguar again, feeling its vibration through the steering wheel. Ahead of me lay an open road, just like a future I could, for the first time in a long while, look forward to without fear. With the window down and the wind tossing my hair, I drove toward the sunrise, carrying not just my father's memories, but the certainty that some legacies are worth protecting at any cost. The Jaguar purred gently as I sped along the coastal road. The garage would be waiting when I got back, not as a target, not as a symbol of resistance, but simply as a place where mechanical stories were preserved and revived, one piece at a time. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this.